everyone. Thank you for joining us for our very first episode of the Keeping It Behavioral podcast, where we're empowering parents one episode at a time and breaking down behavioral analytic topics to what they look like in the real world.
I'm Adrienne.
And I'm Ray.
And today we're going to be talking about parent shaming. I feel like most, if not all parents, I know I'm a new mom and I feel this all the time, but have experienced parent shaming at some point or another. And I feel like especially within the autism community, it's even more prevalent. And I think parents are even just more aware of it. So we did look it up, and according to the India Times, parent shaming is defined as when a parent or caregiver is judged, scolded, or criticized for how they are raising their children.
And I feel like, too, like you said, this is something that is not, it's experienced by literally every single parent, whether or not a diagnosis is present. But I feel like a lot of times, even in the family guidances that we're providing with our patients, it comes up so frequently. And so we kind of chose this as our first topic just to kind of open the conversation up, to let parents know, different supports they can look for with ABA, and knowing that there's no right or wrong way to parent. Even though it's easy to look around and think that there is only one way to raise a child.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times too, like even looking at when children are first diagnosed, there's a lot of parent shame, and I think parent guilt is like a whole nother topic that we could go into too, but just shame with if they feel like they're noticing things they're concerned about. And I know personally, like working with children who are very new, right on their diagnosis, there are a lot of families who are like, well, we're wondering if something was going on, like we were concerned about it. And
did we look into it soon enough?
Yeah,
if we had done
or
it?
they feel like they went to their doctor and their doctor kind of brushed it off, or,
right.
Told them like, well, you're overthinking it because every kid, does X, Y, or Z. When in reality, right, like parents know their kids best. And especially if you have had multiple children or you're around children a lot, like there are things that kids always do, but the extent that they're doing them varies of like what the kind of continuum of typical is versus where it goes into that atypical, where it's like, okay, I want to get additional resources to support my child. Right.
And this is something we kind of explored a little bit in our first Instagram post, which if you don't follow us already, it's Keeping It Behavioral on Instagram. But we kind of we touched on that a little bit too, where especially if you get the diagnosis, like there's always the what ifs that are running through your mind, what if I had gotten a diagnosis sooner? What if I had gotten into ABA sooner? And just like what Adrienne said, at the end of the day, your child best. If something feels off, if something feels like it's not maybe matching up with developmental norms, seeking out those resources is always going to be huge.
Yeah, and I think too, if you feel like you're talking to your child's provider about it and you're getting either like pushback or a lot of judgment with it, it never hurts to get a second opinion, and ask somebody else, if, go to a different doctor for a visit, or like seek out if there's an evaluation that you can get for your child, just because, I feel like parent shame sometimes is a big barrier to accessing services, just because of, the awareness. And I feel like too, right, in the world that we live in that is so accessible, like you see people posting things online, and I think there's a lot of internal shame that comes with that, like not necessarily that somebody's outright like saying something to you or implying something, but you're like, oh, like I'm seeing this online or something like that, and then it just kind of like internalizes and is so easy to spiral.
Well, I think that's why it's also so important too, is to look into different communities, right? I mean, there are so many resources out there. And what Adrienne was talking about with providers, I mean, there's so many providers out there for a variety of different types of services. So it's important that, as you are looking for those resources, you really are finding a good fit for you, your family, and your values. I think this goes for really any provider, not just within ABA, but they should be working with you, not against you. And you don't ever want to be put in a space where they're only adding to
Absolutely.
the anxieties and feelings that you're already having surrounding your child's diagnosis, and maybe the uncertainty you might be feeling about them hitting certain developmental milestones, or, what is school going to look like? Things like that.
Well, and I think too, really like kind of speaking it out, right? So like, let's say like you got a diagnosis, right? You've gotten your child in like ABA services, and you're having those family guidance or parent engagement or whatever, the company that you're working with calls them, because everyone calls it their own thing. Really just being like upfront if you ever do feel like, maybe they're not listening to you, or you feel like you're getting some sort of like judgment or shame. And really kind of just calling it out, because I think a lot of times as behavior analysts, right, like we have our analytical background, to where we're like looking at these concepts, we're listening to what families give to us and what kind of they're seeing. And I think sometimes, right, we can't read people's minds. And so sometimes I think things kind of get lost in translation of like what's really important. Or, what is concerning or not concerning, or all of those things, and really just having kind of that upfront conversation of like, hey, I don't think you're listening to what I'm trying to say. Right. So that way it can be addressed proactively, right? And then
honesty also functions as a foundation of quality care for any provider that you're working with too, right? You want to trust them to be able to be honest with them, because that's where you're going to see some of the best results. And I will say too, I feel like when you're looking for providers, I'm thinking of course just about ABA because that's our experience. But I feel like it's okay to shop around and find a good provider, because not all of them are going to have the value base that you might be looking for your child. And that's not, to shame any one company over the other, but it's more so to say that there's power in the knowledge of seeking out resources and finding your fit and being intentional with that fit. Because a lot of places, I mean, at the end of the day, it is a business, right? Like they're going to want to pull you in, get you started, and all ABA, I think, it can have some really amazing outcomes, but I do think it's important as you're kind of, scoping out what your options are, to figure out what your fit is. What are your priorities for your child? Have those as, the first part of your conversations with new providers, and don't be afraid to jump in there and ask them questions about their programming style, their value base, because it's very important, of course, that it aligns with the long-term objectives you have for your child.
Well, and I think too, kind of just going off of what you said, right? It's just like in real life, right? Like not everybody is your best friend who you mesh really well with. And it's not saying that any one person or any one company is better than another, but it's just kind of finding what really jives and finding, a support system, right? Because that ultimately is our job, right? Is to support you, is to support your kiddos, and, really making sure that it's a supportive relationship rather than a relationship where you feel like you have to like hide things that, you feel like, well, they're going to judge me, or they're not going to understand where this is coming from, and kind of perpetuate that shame on itself, because they feel like, well, if I tell you, what things are actually going on, that you may feel a certain way, or you won't be able to help me, or you won't be able to like get me resources because there'll be that judgment there. When in reality, addressing those up front can really help kind of figure out what the barriers are, so that way it doesn't just perpetuate.
I'm sure too there's that underlying anxiety of, parents already internalizing that as their fault. So admitting that there are barriers can be hard, because you're like, oh my gosh, if I admit this out loud, is this going to be something that it's going to confirm all the anxieties that I've had, that it's my fault. And I think that it's something to make very clear. I know this is not obviously the topic of our episode, but autism is not anyone's fault.
Absolutely not.
And I feel like that's a very important thing to say, because there's obviously a lot of discussion about causes of autism, treatments of autism, all the things. But I think the number one thing that I I think we both hope that everyone takes away from this episode is knowing that, again, there's no right or wrong way to raise a child. You know your child best. It is no one's fault. There are no faults. It's just trying to set an environment up, you know, where both you as the family unit and your child can be successful.
Yeah, and I think, you know, another component of that, right, is autism looks so different for every individual.
Yes.
And there's, you know, autistic individuals aren't the same, right? And I feel like, which, I mean, this is a whole nother topic we can dive into,
We're
right?
Here, like, we have 10 ideas.
Where, you know, like, what qualities, right, are what some people's strengths are, where that might be a deficit for someone else, just like all humans, right? Like, we all have our strengths and our weaknesses that, like, we kind of cater, you know, our professions towards, or, you know, our relationship towards, of what the strengths and weaknesses are. You know, I think that's the same with autism, and really making sure, like, looking individually, you know, of what those areas are.
Which I think is a good question too when you're looking at providers. I mean, that's one of the first things I think as a parent I would ask is, you know, how are the treatments for my child being individualized?
Yeah.
How many kids are you supporting on your caseload? I know, I think in our experience too, you know, we have a lot of different questions that being in it.
Which, I mean, I feel like we could go on a whole nother tangent.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that'd be a whole other thing. But, you know, we'll get into that. Tune in for a future episode. That'll be something we'll talk about. But,
well, and I think going back to kind of like the parent shaming, the parent guilt, right, is I think, you know, especially right in the technological era that we live in, right? You can Google anything. Not that Google is reliable. I feel like especially with things pertaining to autism, it's kind of
everything's TikTok.
Whatever version of the talk.
Yeah, what do they call it? What, like the TikTok types that you're on? What is that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's just like the word talk.
Oh yeah, it's like cook talk.
Yeah.
Or like yeah.
Yeah, like
do you have TikTok?
No, I'm not a TikToker.
Okay. I'm on Cook Talk for all those that are TikTokers. I don't ever post anything.
Yeah.
I never will post anything.
Send Ray the Cook Talk text.
Yeah, please do. I love a good recipe.
But, you know, going back to like the shame, I feel like, so right, we have all of these resources at your fingertips where, like, you know, because I know for my son, like, he's 8 months. Like, I literally will Google, like, 8-month-old XYZ.
Is this normal?
Yeah, like, is this normal or whatever.
Yeah.
Or, like, I took him to the dentist the other day, right? And I've done my research, so I know.
You know what you're
that
doing.
I'm supposed to be brushing his teeth twice a day, right? And then the dentist asks me.
When he's that little?
Yes. As soon as they get teeth, you're supposed to start brushing them. Your husband.
Yeah, literally. my husband is going to be a dentist, and I don't know this, so what does that say about me?
So, but, like, you're supposed to start right away. And I feel like when I went to the dentist, right, that was the first thing he asked me, like, so are you brushing his teeth? And I was like,
immediately feel some type of
because you know, like, yes, I know I'm supposed to be brushing his teeth, but, like, in reality, right, like, sometimes it doesn't happen, and most of the time if it does happen, it happens once a day, because that is my routine right now, and that's like what's doable. But I think, like, even like talking to him, right, he, you know, is also a parent, and he's like, I have 2 kids, they're 6 and 4, and I'm be honest, doesn't always happen. And I think that kind of like real conversation of like, right, and I think ABA sometimes gets kind of like a bad rap, or like just a bad reputation,
again,
which is another topic. But
yeah.
You know, right, like, and I mean with any scientific field, right, there is like, this is what it is, right, this is the definition of it, this is what it looks like in practice, but in reality it's not the same,
right? Because,
you know, in reality you have life, you have everything else going on, and it doesn't always translate exactly like how, you know it should be in theory. But then I think that does become a thing that kind of perpetuates the guilt of like, I know this, right? I have the resources where I can look up like what I should be doing, or like what things I should be doing to my kid. And it can be really hard because it's like sometimes like I just have to make it through the day. And it doesn't, you know, if we make it through the day and everyone is safe and healthy,
it's a win. It's a good day.
That's a good day. And I think it's okay to like keep that as a frame of mind is like some days it is just kind of like we're gonna make it through the day and survive it,
And that's what it is.
and that's what it is, and not letting anyone make you feel any certain way about that.
Well, I think you're hitting on a key, I feel like, theme unintentionally that we've kind of been covering is when you're with a good provider, they should be meeting you where you're at, right? Like,
Yeah.
like, you know, your son's dentist, like a good provider hears like, oh, okay, yeah, realistically, I had a day, he's alive and he's here.
Yeah.
And great, we got the dentist appointment. And he's like, okay, cool, I've been through that myself. And I feel like a good provider hears the barriers or hears like, this is what life is looking like right now and says, okay, here's what we can do to get him, you know, to get you there, to get him there, to set you up for success. Because there should never be any shame with that. That should just be like, yeah, you know, that is really hard. That is a reality, and that's okay because the plans that we're writing for our kids should be catered toward whatever that family's reality is. And if you're working with a provider that doesn't do that, I would say that's a red flag.
Yeah, 100%. And I think too, right, like as parents, I think it's also important to kind of like self-reflect because, right, as we kind of talked about, everyone experiences this regardless of, you know, their child's development, their child's history, anything
not even
like
just
that.
With children. I feel like that's
true.
Like,
yeah,
it's
societal.
There's like societal guilt that you have about like with your field or with your kids. I mean, gosh, even like with pet ownership.
Yes.
And that's like such a micro, like not even remote to having a child. I mean, which is such a, that's a massive responsibility.
Yeah.
And even that, you have people being like, oh, you're feeding your dog this? They're supposed to be having organic and whole food, you know.
But I think it's important too, right? Like to, you know, I feel like mental health is becoming such a prevalent conversation nowadays. And I think it's important too to like remember, right? Like, yes, what you're feeling is normal, but it's also normal to like seek out help specifically to yourself too, you know? And I mean, I think
that's a great topic right there. That's good.
Right? Like, going through the process and the emotions of, you know, getting a diagnosis, whether or not you kind of knew where you felt like it was going to go or if it was kind of out of the blue. You know, when I worked in schools, there would be kids who came in and their parents just thought like, oh, like they're just a little bit delayed in speech. And then we would have kind of the autism conversation. And to them, it was like, oh my God, like, that was not where I thought this was going. Where there are other, you know, families I've spoken to where they were like, yeah, like
we had a
when,
feeling
you know, I've known this was coming since they were like 9 months old and I just knew it was going to happen. But I feel like either, you know, which side of that spectrum you're on, I think recognizing like it's okay if I need to like get support for myself because you shouldn't feel shame of having any sort of like feelings, you know, good, bad, indifferent, whatever, about your child's diagnosis because ultimately like the important thing is you got it, right? Like you've got the steps and you're working towards whatever that looks like for your family, but also remembering that you as a parent should get the support you need to.
That is,
you know,
so important.
Having the conversation with your partner or your family or your support system.
Like
absolutely.
And dynamics with other children you might have in the home. I mean,
and that's a whole nother
can of worms. But that, I mean, that is a huge thing. And I feel like, I mean, I even think about respite care, right? Where I'm not providing those direct ABA services, but I am still providing care. And almost every family I've worked with, the primary care providers for, you know, their children who have some sort of intellectual difference or autism or something, they're not taking care of themselves because there's this guilt that if I take care of myself, I'm taking away from the care that I'm able to give for my child, who's my most precious human in this whole world. And I think it's important that we're highlighting the fact that you can only give so much. You can't give from an empty cup. And you are deserving of the type of supports that you're also seeking out for your child because this is a journey for you as a caretaker and parent as well.
Well, and I think really finding that team that you can lean on, right? Like whether you know, it's through public school, whether it's like public school, whether it's public school, whether it's, you know, an ABA clinic, whether it's in-home ABA, whether
social
it's
groups or whatever.
Social groups, whether it's your family, you know, just kind of like finding who's there for that you can lean on, that can help support you, so that way you can be like present.
Well, it takes a village with every child.
Absolutely.
Right? Like there's always going to be people you're going to find to lean on, you know, like you said, it could be your friends, it could be your direct family, and figuring out what that network looks like for you, because you should be around people that lift you up, right?
Absolutely.
That sets you and your kid up for success.
Yeah.
But
so, you know, I feel like we could talk about this all day, but, you know, I think that's kind of just our, you know,
I guess that's our main topic
for today. So, you know, just remember, we are keeping it behavioral. So we're guiding autism and fostering hope. So please follow us on Insta at Keeping It Behavioral.
Yes.
Also, just a disclaimer that we throw out there every time, right? We are behavior analysts, but we're not providing any sort of like specific behavioral analytic or medical individualized advice. Yeah.
Just a safe space in a community that we're trying to create for families.
Absolutely. And just kind of having these conversations that I feel like are a little bit, you know, previously, they're challenging to navigate, and I feel like sometimes they're taboo too, right? Because nobody wants to like admit that these things are like very normal and that everyone goes through them.
Yes.
And really just kind of having like a very accessible conversation.
Yeah.
So, all right, we'll see you next time.
Yeah, we'll see you next time.